It's a pleasure to be with you guys in your group. I'm so thankful that you've taken some time out of your weekend to be here. And it's fun for me to be here in this summit. I hope it's informative, and I also hope it's a way to feel like you're part of the community. I know for many of the kids and teenagers I see, and adults as well, I mean, COVID has been so isolating and so overwhelming. And to feel like you can see other faces and see other names, I think is a blessing right now. A lot of my friends and colleagues will be on later, Dr. Bennett and Adams, Dr. Lindsay, and then I'm so excited that you're going to get to hear from Ben Brown. He does the Tourette's podcast, and I had a chance to meet him last year. He's just a wonderful person and storyteller as well. And there's so many youth ambassadors and rising leaders who I know are speaking up as well in this summit. And I have had the chance to talk with some of them in the past, and they're a great group of wonderful role models as well of how to live from a place of strength with tics and Tourette's. So I want to, I can't see the chat once I go into the PowerPoint. So I wanted to start by, at least if you could just type in the chat, what city you're in, or state or country if you're outside of the US. As you heard, I think I'm in South Carolina, but that way we can give some people some shout outs and see where everybody's from geographically. Canada, San Diego, Florida, California, Detroit, Ohio, Minnesota, Florida, New York, Texas. Man, you guys are covering all geography. Nebraska, Georgia, not so far away from me. Canada. Awesome, guys. Awesome. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen again. Thanks for your comments. I so appreciate that. Scranton, like the office, and Oregon. I love Oregon. All right, let's see. All right, so it's a pleasure, as I said, to be here with you guys. I am in South Carolina, and I work almost exclusively with teenagers, as well as with young adults who live with tics and Tourette's, as well as those who live with OCD and anxiety. And so I'm going to move through the presentation, and I won't be able to look through the comments to the very end, and Angela might help me kind of see if there's any themes that emerge there. But our game plan here today, after we go through my disclosures, as you see, I do some work with the Tourette Association. I do a type of treatment called CBIT, or Comprehensive Behavioral Intervention for Tics. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a therapy that we use to assist people who are bothered by their tics, when they're really, their tics are causing pain, or their tics are causing impairment or functional problems, and they want to work on them. We use CBIT as one of the ways to help folks with their tics. But today, we're talking more about resilience. And so I put down here some of our objectives, or kind of our game plan together. And one thing we're going to talk about is just what is resilience, and what do we mean when we say being resilient, and how can a person develop resilience? As we're going to talk in a moment, resilience isn't something you like have or don't have. Resilience is something that you can come to develop, and some of the skills we're going to talk through today. And we're not just talking about the struggles and difficulties that come from living with tics or Tourette syndrome, but what we know about some of these strategies I'm going to talk through today are useful for everything from anxiety to depression to pain to relationship problems to school struggles, because resilience really, as we're going to talk in a moment about, is about learning how to face whatever shows up. And so much has shown up for us in the last year. I know that 2020 has been a struggle for so many people that I've seen. And I think it's a year unlike any other. And so resilience couldn't be a more timely topic than what we're talking about here at the beginning of 2021. So like, what do we mean when we say resilience? You know, resilience basically means the ability to withstand and rebound from adversity. So tough stuff, really challenging stuff happens in life, and you emerge from that experience feeling more strengthened and more resourceful. And what we know is that it doesn't come easy, that to find yourself in a place of resilience, you often have to go through really high times of emotional distress. you really have to feel overwhelmed sometimes, or anxious, or depressed, or just dealing with that burdensome feeling on your shoulders. That often is part of learning and finding ways to develop resilience. And as I said a moment ago, it's not a trait we have or don't have. It's something that we're going to talk some about how we can develop it and how we can facilitate it. So I mentioned I'm here in South Carolina. I didn't see anybody say North Carolina, but I grew up in North Carolina on the Outer Banks. So some of you may have seen the show Outer Banks on Netflix. So that was where I grew up, was on the beach of North Carolina. So I often love this image of palm trees swaying in the breeze, but not really the breeze, a very massive wind, a hurricane. Because we definitely had a lot of those growing up. And it's a really nice metaphor or imagery for what do we mean when we say resilience? So to think about it this way, trees can do all sorts of things in the midst of a storm. One thing they may do is they may swing back and forth, and they may adjust by kind of blowing in the breeze to accommodate the breeze. And then when the wind stops, the tree is sort of standing back up straight, and it is been touched and battered, but is still there and is still strong in some way. And that's what we're talking about when we say resilience in some ways, is bending and accommodating and being flexible, like in the midst of life's really hard storms that come our way. But resilience even takes it to the next level. It's as part of going through that storm, like our roots get deeper or stronger, or all of the leaves somehow develop a layer of strength where like we're ready for the next storm in that way. And so that's what we're talking about, a degree of learning how to bend and learning how to move with the changes in life, because the only constant really is change. So I'm going to give you some ideas of like, well, what are some examples of being resilient? And these are actual items from this little survey called the Davidson Resilience Scale. And a little snapshot, I did one of the presentations for the Rising Leaders a year or so ago. And as part of being there, we gave them the Davidson Resilience Scale. And what I'm going to show you at the very end of the presentation is some of their responses and what we know about some of the emerging adults, some of the emerging leaders who are living with tics and Tourette. So it's just confidentially, I'll tell you some about how they grew and their own strength and what they identified as strengths. So here's some examples. I am able to adapt when changes occur. I have at least one close and secure relationship that helps me when I'm stressed. As we talk about resilience, relationships, and I saw some folks comment in the chats in the last presentation, family and feeling like, does my family really understand? Does my mom or dad or brother or sister or cousins, do people really get it? Is important in developing resilience. Past successes give me confidence to handle new challenges. I try to see the humorous side of things when I'm faced with problems. When I think about my own struggles when I was a teenager and young adult, dealing with ups and downs, I think being able to find humor in sometimes really challenging things was the way that I found that was helpful to cope. And many of the kids I work with have taught me so much about finding ways to find confidence and humor in really tough stuff. I prefer to take the lead in solving problems rather than letting others make decisions. You're talking about leadership skills. And dealing with life's problems, sometimes you have to act on a hunch without knowing why. This means like sort of leaning into uncertainty. And then, and lastly, feeling like you have a strong sense of purpose, or developing a sense of purpose. I mean, nobody imagines that we're always going to know exactly our purpose and meaning, but developing that and seeking that out. So these are some of the things we mean when we talk about resilience. So I'm a big proponent of metaphors and imagery. And so I'm going to take you through this picture of, thinking about what we're going to talk about today is a bit of a road trip. And I saw some folks who said they were out west. And so That's what this reminds me of, is that think of this as a metaphor of driving through your life. Living your life is like driving this van on the road, going for this drive. And we're driving this in the direction of trying to find a sense of resilience, trying to find a sense of purpose. And so our roadmap are these 5 things. So these are the 5 things I'm going to talk you through. These are 5 of the components that we use in a type of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And we also use them just in general day-to-day practice. We know they can help anyone who's trying to develop a sense of resilience. So first up comes social support. So if you think about yourself in that van going on a journey, you know, at least if you're like me, nobody likes going on a road trip alone. And so we need to stop along the way and have people we can talk to, have people we can be there with. We know that the quality of our lives is often dependent on the quality of our relationships. You know, people need people. That's what's so powerful, I find, about some of these Tourette Association meetups, is that, you know, you're able to, even though somebody may be in New York and somebody may be in California, you're able to see and be with other people who are interdependent. You know, 2020 has made that really hard. I have 3 kids myself, and my daughter, who is almost 11, knew I was coming to do this, and she said, I was flipping through my slides this morning, and she said, "Oh, that's a nice slide, but it's a little sad because all those little people on your slide aren't socially distanced," you know, which is just like, like so heartbreaking in a way that this has become our new normal, but to keep ourselves and others safe. But what we know is that interdependence, being able to like be with people and communicate with people, whether it be online or whether it be in person, is so protective. And isolation, being alone, is like the best friend of depression. So when you're alone, that's a big challenge and big thing that can lead people to feel pretty depressed or pretty alone. Because part of what happens, if you think about even the last presenter, part of what happens when we're alone is we're subject to kind of get up in our own heads and compare ourselves online to other people and get into sort of the not good enough story. You know, I'm not as good as this person. I'm not as good as that person. And the opposite is when we're with other people, we know that, like, just like if you eat your favorite food, my son's birthday is today and he is turning 7. And so we got him donuts for breakfast from a special place called Duck Donuts. And, you know, when he ate those donuts this morning, he like lit up, he was smiling, he's really excited. And it, in his brain, those reward centers of his brain light up. And the same thing happens when we're with people who we feel like they really get it. They really get us. They really get the experience of living with tics. They really get the experience of living with challenging things. And we know that the opposite, when we feel rejected, they've done studies that say that the parts of our brain that if we were in physical pain light up. So emotional pain is so much like physical pain. So people get a lot of benefits from being generous, being compassionate, and helping other people. I think in part, this is some of the real benefits of the Youth Ambassadors program and the Rising Leaders programs, is that it gives you a way to give back, to advocate, to be there for other people, and to know how to kind of talk about tics and that experience and spread awareness. So our social communities are more accepting of folks who are living with tics. So, you know, building resilience, we know, as I just said, is not an independent task. You need a team and you need support. You need support from friends, from family. I like to hope I'm a big support for the people I work with as a provider, from teachers, and I'm a coach. I coach soccer on the side, from coaches too, you know, all sorts of folks. So how can you begin to assess your social support? So this is one way. Let's use Ellen as an example. So we could say Ellen lives with tics and maybe some depression and some anxiety. And she has this bullseye that she made. And on the inside of the bullseye, we would say, are the person or people who really get it, And so maybe let's say her dad, her father here himself lives with tics. And so that's somebody she feels like she can go to, somebody she can talk about all the stuff, all the feelings, all the hard stuff that comes up. And then maybe the next ring out is people that she may share some stuff with, right? She may share some stuff about what's going on, the emotional experience, or what it's like to live with tics. And these might be friends or her sister. It may be colleagues. Let's say she goes to a musical theater program to perform. She may open up with them a little bit. But then the outer ring, that might be, a boyfriend or her other parent or another friend that she may decide to be a little bit more guarded with. And self-disclosure is a big thing that I find people who are living with tics often are thinking about. Like, is this person safe for me to share some of what I'm living with? Is this person safe to say, I live with tics? Sometimes the kids and teenagers I work with developed a bit of a script. Like, the reason I'm doing this is because I live with something called Tourette syndrome. And what that means is that while you can control all your movements and noises, sometimes I have a hard time with that. Sometimes I can't. And some of my movements and some of the noises I make are completely out of my control. And I can try to control them, I can try to manage them, but sometimes that's a really hard thing to do. But thanks for asking, why I'm doing this. But there may be people that we don't want to share that with because they're rude or because they're bullies or because they're going to further try to do things like mockery and just really rude, nasty things. So we kind of have to think, where does this person I'm interacting with fall in my bullseye? And are the people in my bullseye helping me overcome adversity? Are they helping me get stronger? Are they listening to me? Do they encourage me? And as we think about that, we're kind of navigating our boundaries. How much do we want to open up or not open up? How much do we want to be vulnerable with putting ourselves out there? Because, with vulnerability comes risk, but can also come connection. But we at least know from the research, people need at least somebody, one person that they feel like that they can connect with who gets it. And I found with a lot of the folks I see that they may have a whole large community, but some of the folks I see, we really have to work at it for them to find someone. Sometimes it takes a good bit of time to find someone who you feel like really understands you and your lived experience. So the second part, as we go through these 5 things of building resilience, is identifying your map or your guide, like your GPS. Like, how do we know what choices to make or which direction to go? We know we want other people along for this journey, but what is it that you want to value? And by value, I mean, like, who do you want to be? I don't really mean like a job or your career. I mean, that's scary stuff to think about. It was scary when I was a teenager to be like, oh man, like, what do I want to do when I get older? But more what I mean is, like, what matters to you most and what quality do you want to live out the most? We are in January 2021. This is the time of New Year's resolutions, And a New Year's resolution, for a lot of people, they like it. It's kind of like a goal, like, I want to run a 5K, might be an example of a New Year's resolution. What I'm talking about here is a little bit different. It's like a guide or a direction we're moving. It's like a characteristic or a quality. And you're never going to fully get there. It just keeps directing you with what you're doing and why you're doing it. So here's an example of a list of potential values, which might be like, I want to be, in what I do, authentic. Or I want to be adventurous, right? Like, life's short. I want to be adventurous. I want to be balanced. Like, it's really hard to balance maybe my work and my extracurriculars and my school. I want to be creative. Like, I don't want to be boxed in. I want to think out of the box. Or I don't have a big community right now, and I want to develop at least a small community. Maybe for you, your faith is important to you. Or just personal growth. Like, with every decision I make, I hope I can grow, or I can have humor. I can laugh at myself, Maybe 2020 pointed out to you that you care a lot about justice. I care about justice, and I care about people being treated fairly and appropriately. Maybe you want to move forward saying, I care about kindness or respecting myself or respecting other people. Or maybe you want to be a little bit more open about what's going on. And so it could be anything that's a characteristic for you that you say, you know, as I go through my life, there's going to be so many choices day in and day out. And it's going to be so easy to get swept up in my head with my own internal critic and with my own internal chatter that happens, as we're going to talk about more in a minute. But I'm going to keep saying, how in this moment, even with everything going on, could I do something compassionate? Or could I do something kind of bold? Or could I do something loving or caring for someone else? Your value is yours. Nobody else can take that away from you. It's whatever you think matters most to you in your life. You know, for me, my value, I would say, is connection. It's so easy for me to get lost in my phone at home with my kids, or not be really listening to what my wife is saying, or be distracted at work. And every moment I try to say, I want to connect with them. I want to connect with the people that sit across from me in therapy. I want to connect as much as we can right now through the computer. So your value, let your value be your guide, because it's so easy to get swept up into everything else. That's kind of our default mode, is this negative internal voice is our default mode very often. So the next thing I want to chat a bit about is just being aware of your choice points. And so when you're driving your car, when you're just like when you're going through life, you're going to come to a lot of forks in the road. You're going to come to a lot of choice points to say, I could do a lot of things right now. What do I most want to do right now? So if you look over at the image on the right, you see, at the bottom there, situations and thoughts and feelings. And I would say that, you're going to bump up against a lot of hard situations. And unfortunately, I think living with tics and Tourette's, you'll bump up against more challenging situations than the average teenager would. And a situation might be somebody's really rude, or you're excluded in a time when you really want to be included. Or you may be doing something like this, giving a performance situation where you have to give a speech or talk in front of other people, and tough stuff shows up. Other things that can show up is negative thoughts, critical thoughts, doubting thoughts, or just like hard feelings. It may be sadness or fear or shame or guilt. I'm reminded of that movie. One of my favorite movies is Inside Out, with the whole chorus of feelings in her mind. And that's really the way we function, is we have a whole chorus of feelings in our mind that speak up at various times in our day-to-day life. And our default mode is that left arrow, is we often, most of us, get hooked by that stuff. We might get in the habit of avoiding really tough things, or we might get stuck up in our head. We might get stuck in the spin of like going over and over and over things that we feel stressed out about. Like a bit of a merry-go-round in our mind is how one person I see calls it. Or we may find ourselves in really dark, scary mental places. We may get hooked by those things. And so the problem is when we get caught by all that stuff, that it moves us away from our values. So it moves us away from those things I talked about on the last slide. It moves us away from being able to connect with other people, or to be authentic. Like, I want to be who I want to be, or to be creative in the way we might want to be. And so really the last couple things I'm going to talk to you about here are going to help hopefully get us moved over to being unhooked. And what I mean is all that hard stuff is going to show up. There's going to be hard situations and thoughts and feelings, but we can do some things to unhook from some of this internal stuff that's hard, or unhook from some of the feelings that show up. And the hope here, right, is that moves us towards, then you can reorient yourself to your values. So if you think about the last presenter, I was able to see a piece of her conversation in the same way that if you're meditating or being mindful, you like bring your attention back to your breath. Or if that's uncomfortable, you may bring your attention back to what you see, or you may bring your attention back to some sounds that you hear. You know, you kind of reorient yourself to that. In the same way here, what we're saying is when hard stuff shows up, we have some ways of bringing ourselves back to, you know, in this moment, no matter what's showing up, I'm going to say, what could I do to live out my value and move towards the kind of person that I want to be? So if my 30-year-old self or my 20-year-old self was standing here, he or she would say, God, I'm proud of you. You did an amazing job showing up even in a really, really tough moment and tough things. So let's move through some of these like unhooking things before we have some time for some questions and some discussion. And so on our drive, you know, as you're driving through your life and trying to pursue the value that matters to you and who you want to be, it's kind of like you're the driver of the bus. But fortunately or unfortunately, the bus is full of lots of other passengers. And these passengers are kind of like all the chatter in your mind. And whether or not you live with anxiety or depression or whatever, you know, label we want to put on it, or if you're just human, and I tend to assume maybe even dogs and cats and other animals have this too, we have mental chatter. There's a lot of conversation happening in our head. There's a lot of conversation happening on your bus. And some of the most common examples I hear are, you know, you can't do this, you know, or you might hear kind of in your mind, you're too tall, or you're too short, or you're overweight, or you're too thin, or some critical, really like hard critical things. Or you might hear, oh, you can't go that way, or you can't pursue that dream. You're not as good as them, you know. I was just meeting with a 14-year-old yesterday who lives with tics and Tourette's, an amazing artist, but was saying that they were getting hooked by looking on Instagram and other people's art pages, the things other people were creating, and were hearing sort of in their bus, hearing in their mind, you're not as good an artist as them. Maybe you should just give up on that dream, you know? And so the key is to recognize in part that everybody I've ever met has a lot of passengers on their bus. Some of us just may have a little bit more on our bus. And one of the first skills is being able to notice and name that mental chatter is happening. Because very often we kind of get hooked by it and we get caught, right? And we're stuck in the loop of, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough, or whatever the critical thing is. So sometimes just getting a little bit of like space from it. And you might say something to yourself like, I notice myself having the feeling of feeling really anxious right now. I can kind of step back and observe myself having that feeling. Or I notice my mind saying this really hurtful thing to me, or this really critical thing. Or I notice the thought coming up right now that I can't do this. Or I kind of notice my critic chiming in to say something really hurtful to me right now. I often like to think of it, I have a puppet here in my office of a parrot, and the mascot of the school I went to was the Pirates. So I kind of love the visual of a pirate sitting there with a parrot on his shoulder. And that's a little bit of what this is like. It's like that passenger in the bus is a little bit like a parrot sitting on our shoulder, just like squawking in our ear, saying just really constant, really not helpful things. Um, and so one thing to know is this painful stuff shows up for us usually about things we care about the most, about things that matter to us, about who we want to be, about the direction we want to go. And so noticing it and naming it is the first step, is it gives us a little bit of space with it to realize like thoughts are words. They're words that most of us just get to flash through our mind. They're words we've internalized from other people. There's things we may have heard other people say to us and we've kind of sucked it up like a sponge, where we may be able to get some space from it and say like, do I really even believe that thought? Or might actually not be completely true. Like actually may I still be able to drive my bus in the direction I want to go, even while I have that thought, right? An example is every day of my life, I usually think, oh God, I don't feel like going for a run, or I don't feel like going to the gym, or I don't feel like interacting with this person maybe. And yet I can still have that chatter and care about being healthy and do that thing, even while I'm hearing this nonstop mental, like, oh, I don't feel like doing this thing. It's awful, And it's a skill that, I'm still working on. I think most people are working on from now until the day they leave this earth, is trying to really work on building their ability to like notice the passengers on your bus, notice that stuff going on, but still driving your bus in the direction of the value of who you have decided you want to be. So I mentioned earlier that I enjoy coaching, and I think one of the greatest outlets for a lot of the young people and young adults that I see is sports. But if you're not into sports, we can think of this not as just sports, but your conductor, or music instructor, or your teacher, But it's helpful to think about like, one thing we have on our bus is a bit of a coach of sorts. And coach one, you could probably think if you've had a coach or teacher like this, would be somebody who's yelling or screaming or what are you doing, or criticizing, or saying you can't make mistakes and get yourself together, like just saying really hurtful things, in our heads. But I certainly hope I'm not that kind of coach. I want to be this kind of coach, supportive, encouraging, friendly, saying, we're going to make mistakes. It's a bit of trial and error. We gotta like get some feedback and work through it, right? We're gonna put one foot in front of the other. We're gonna have good days and we're gonna have really horrible days, but we're gonna work through it. So frequently, sometimes we think, not all of us, but a lot of us, particularly if you struggle with perfectionism, and it's certainly something that I've dealt with in my own life, and that you feel as if the only way you can make progress is if you sort of hammer yourself in your head, you criticize yourself, you tell yourself you got to be better. But when you act like coach one, when we get hooked by that voice, the problem there is it can be paralyzing. It can really cause us to shut down and not be able to do much of anything. In the same way that if a teacher or an adult or a coach has ever done that, it's paralyzing, it's overwhelming. So the last skill I want to spend a few minutes talking about is developing that skill of, as you name and notice, all this mental chatter and this noise on the bus, and you're trying to develop some social support along the way, that you also develop a sense of self-compassion. And this could not pair any better than what you just heard in those mindfulness exercises. May I be happy. May I be content. May I be at peace. May I be gentle with myself. What we know is that this is called self-compassion. It's kind of like we could call it self-kindness, or if you don't like either of those words, you could say just friendliness, being with yourself the same way that you would be with somebody you really, really care about. If a close friend reached out to you and said, hey, I need help with this, or I'm struggling with that, like how you would want to respond to that person. So lots of science, a lot of research says this is linked. When you can work to this place and work day in and day out to be self-compassionate, it's linked to less mental health struggles. It's linked to better relationships, and it's linked to more satisfaction in your life. And so I'm going to try to give you a few steps of like what are some ways of dealing with self-compassion. So we've already kind of talked about the first one. I think, the first thing is to notice the hard stuff, because if we don't notice it, we get caught by it before we even realize it. And that's fast. That's our van going 0 to 60, So let's say I'll give an example of me today. I'm about to give a presentation on Zoom, and the thought that shows up for a lot of people when they're about to give a presentation, if you're human, is usually the thought, you're gonna look weird, or you're gonna mess this up, or this is totally not gonna be helpful. Some sort of thought like that may show up. So the first step is to take a breath, or to just kind of ground yourself, press your feet into the floor and say, I notice my mind is saying that this isn't going to go well, or this is going to really be a bomb. This is not going to be helpful at all, And I bet that's showing up because I care about this. I care about this being helpful or useful in some way. So the first step is to kind of notice whatever that thing is that pops up in your head. The second thing that this comes out of the work of Kristin Neff, who does a lot of writing about self-compassion. The second thing is about recognizing our common humanity. What does that mean? That means realizing that though at that moment you may feel very alone. I'm very much alone in my office right now, but I'm not alone in that there are thousands and millions of people who have struggled with that feeling of about to give a presentation and having that thought pop up. And similarly, I think living with tics and living with Tourette's, I see many people who live in rural South Carolina or live in areas where they've never met anybody else who lives with tics or Tourette's. And so if you don't have access right now to meet or converse with other people who have that experience, I think a piece of this is to be able to say, I know people exist out there. I've looked at the Tourette Association website and on their YouTube channel, and I've gone to the IOCDF OCD website and gone to their YouTube page, and I've heard other people who live with OCD, or other people who live with anxiety, or other people who live with tics and Tourette's. And it may not be everybody, but 1 in 100 or so people lives with these things. And so I'm human, and I am not the only person who's struggling. I'm not alone in this space. Even though other people may look perfect or look like they have it all together, we all are struggling in some ways. And the third piece is that most important self-compassionate piece, which is where you do what you just did in the mindfulness exercise, which is trying to extend some warmth and some care to yourself in this moment. And so before this, I might say, you got this. Just go slow, and remember that even people who struggle can do really hard things, can show up for things that are challenging or difficult. So I want to end with sharing with you the pilot study we did with the rising leaders. This was just a survey we gave, and just to understand a little bit more, for folks who we're talking to who may be 18, 19, 20, in their young adulthood, who are living with tics and Tourette's. And what we know is that the majority of individuals who live with very significant tics, or even mild or moderate tics in their adolescence, about 70, 80% are going to get a good improvement in their tics, or they may subside in their young adulthood, in their college years and adulthood. And so this was this age group of sort of folks who had been very much impacted by their tics. They had sought out this program with the TAA. They wanted to be a leader with tics. And so we had asked them some of those questions you saw me write there before from the Connor Davidson survey. And we found that their growth and resiliency scores were actually in the high group. You know, it could be high, middle, or low. So meaning going through all the ups and downs that can happen when you go through living with Tourette syndrome or tics and going through puberty and middle school and high school and trying to figure it all out. Still, they grew in ways through going through those experiences that they would have never done, and they became more and more resilient. In fact, in about 80% of cases, a little bit more, the participants who filled it out reported moderate to high growth in compassion. Not only were they able to find a way to get more compassionate with themselves, but they also said, because I deal with this, because this is such a struggle sometimes, I feel like I have compassion for other people and their struggles. You know, that's empathy. I feel like I have empathy with, like, I may not be living with cancer, or I may not be living with diabetes, or I may not be living with schizophrenia or something else, but I can be compassionate in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. Like that tree, they were able to withstand adversity. And then the third thing that I think is really interesting is they were able to develop new interests and new opportunities. You know, think about it this way, that if you were not living with tics and Tourette's, you likely would not be attending and taking time out of your day to come to these presentations, which hopefully are going to help you grow and help you have tools in your toolbox to really wow people in your 20s and in your 30s and in your 40s. They did report, which, you know, wasn't too surprising. We see this in research about living with a struggle. They did report their spirituality and religious growth was less. And what we saw when we looked at that was some people said they got more close to their spirituality. So just their sense of connection with nature and the world and being spiritual in that way. Where other people found themselves more connected with, like, an organized religion, which would be more like a church or a temple or something like that. But then a third of people, you know, dealt with it as we often do. They may or may not have been feeling super faithful in that moment, in part because they may be angry, just angry with God or angry with a higher power. Like, why do I have to deal with this? Which is a normal and appropriate thing that happens when people are trying to navigate and come to terms with a condition they're dealing with. And then other people may not have identified with the spiritual or faith-based community or being religious in that way. So that's another reason why we sometimes see those numbers a little bit lower. The notable thing is what we found was there was a negative correlation. So most of you probably know what that means, but that basically means as resilience went up, depression scores were lower. And the more depressed someone was, the more depressed an individual was, then their resilience was lower. And, you know, that makes sense when you think about depression. Depression is a negative worldview. You know, it's kind of like putting on dark, blacked out glasses. And it's very hard not to get hooked by some of the thoughts and things going through a person's mind. Judgmental or critical thoughts. And, you know, isolation is a big part of depression as well, too. And it's why we've seen in 2020 increased rates of things like depression as well. And so it's very important, just as it's important to get some assistance and support with tics, it's also helpful to get some support with depression and anxiety as well. So here are some of my references. As you heard me mention, much of what I talked about today came from a form of therapy that's a form of CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, called ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. And then here is some of my contact information. As you heard Angela mention out the top, I am at the University of South Carolina, so the Gamecocks here in Columbia, South Carolina. And we have a Tourette and Tic Center here that I help co-lead with Dr. Rebecca Lehman, who's a pediatric neurologist. And we work here as a team to help young people who are struggling with tics or with other things that go along with tics that you've probably seen in that iceberg that the TAA shows. So I'm gonna unshare my screen here, and I am going to see if there's any questions. We got about 15 minutes left or so.
Feel free to drop your questions right in the chat, or Dr. Phelps, if you are up for it, people can unmute themselves and ask a question. As long as we do it one at a time, we're open to that too. So we do have a few minutes, guys, so feel free to ask your questions now. And if we don't get to them today, we will definitely let Dr. Phelps know and get to them at another time.
Yeah, if folks want to unmute, or if you feel more comfortable typing in the chat, certainly do that as well.
Don't be shy. You can ask any questions.
So I want to give up folks an opportunity if they definitely want to unmute or if they want to share things. If not, I can kind of talk through some of the questions, but I certainly want to make sure your voices are heard. And I know many of you may have signed on for this to have a chance to speak. So somebody asked what's behind me. So I'm in my office, and this is a feelings chart, and this is another feelings wheel we talk about. It has a lot of different words and stuff for feelings and things like that. So somebody put, I have generalized anxiety disorder. So generalized anxiety disorder features a lot of worry, what if thoughts or catastrophizing thoughts, like what if this happens, or what if that happens, or what if this happens, And if you remember that movie Inside Out, it's sort of like the purple character in there that jumps to worrying. And so somebody said, how do I not worry about my Tourette's, if that makes sense? And to Toby's point, I think that makes perfect sense. One of the hardest things I think that I've learned from folks who I've seen who live with Tourette's is there's so much uncertainty about when the tics are going to get better and when they're going to get worse, and they're sort of waxing and waning pattern. And so it's a very common experience to have thoughts like, what if this gets worse, or what if this gets in my way, or what if this causes a problem in some way, shape, or form in the future that gets worse and worse and worse. The hardest thing about worry is that it's hard to not worry. Our mind is designed for this like negative bias where we're constantly going to be jumping to the future. And so one of the first steps would be, if you notice your mind saying, what if this happens, is I would do, as I mentioned, notice and name that. I notice my mind is living in the future right now. I notice my mind is worrying about this thing that could happen in the future. I notice my mind is saying, what's going to happen when I go out and do this thing? And sometimes we tell people to take it to the next step and to say, what would be the worst thing that would happen? And then what might be the best thing that would happen in this situation? And it's not always the case, but what I've found is that for many things in life, it may not be the worst thing that would happen, and it may not be the best thing that will happen, but it's what's likely sometimes falls between those two things. So we can't always fortune tell the future, but that can help sometimes to say, oh, my mind is jumping to this worst case scenario. But if I kind of think through best and worst and likely, maybe what will actually happen will be something a little less likely than what my mind is predicting. And so that can help us sometimes settle down some of our internal worries. And of course, some of the mindfulness and meditative stuff can help too. Sometimes with worry too, I often tell people to ask themselves, is there anything I can do? Is there anything I can do to help manage this worry? Is there anything I can do to problem solve it? Is there anything I can control? Because controlling the controllables, especially when so much feels out of our control, can be helpful as well. Because sometimes, when you can't do anything about the tic, but there may be other things you could do that will help manage the anxiety of it all, like taking a break or stepping away, texting somebody who really understands or really gets it as well. Somebody said, how should I respond to people telling me that I'm faking Tourette's? Thank you, Georgia. Um, Number one, I want to validate that I'm sorry you had that experience, and that, it's hard enough, I think, to live with tics, but then to have people not validating and saying I'm sorry you're struggling is doubly difficult. So I would go back to that bullseye and in some ways ask myself, um, you know, is this a safe person to engage with an ongoing conversation with us about? And I would worry about the safeness of that person if they're saying that someone's faking. If they're saying it maybe from like a curious perspective, or they just want to understand, I might feel better about having a conversation with them. But many people that I've worked with, where people's mocked them, hey Katrina, mocked them or made fun of them, will say something like, that's pretty hurtful to say. I'm glad that you don't have to live with this, but it's a pretty big struggle to have to live with these tics. I'm sorry you think that I'm doing it on purpose, but it's actually something that is medical, and it's a neurological condition, and I can't control the fact that I do this. And if you're interested, there's a website called Tourette.org, and you can look up some more stuff about it, or we could talk at another time, but not right now, because you may feel pretty heated or pretty upset. The Tourette Association has little cards that can be helpful to disperse or give out. And that way you don't even have to have the whole conversation. You could just say, like, that's not the case at all. Like, why don't you check this out? And just walking away, because it can be certainly challenging to stand there and have to keep engaging with somebody who's being a bully or being a critic in some ways. So what are some ways to practice self-compassion? Self-compassion is something you can practice by both saying things to yourself, like we mentioned earlier, but some people do it through just general self-care. So like for some folks, taking a warm shower, or I have one guy who likes to sit in the hot tub, at his house, or lighting a candle, or buying yourself some new art supplies if you like art, or taking some time to go sit outside alone and applying lotion to your hands, or getting some new makeup or whatever. That's self-care, is really sometimes tied into self-compassion. It's taking care of ourselves, and saying, I deserve to take care of myself. I deserve to do something kind for myself, just as I would encourage a friend to do those sorts of things. So let's see. So I sometimes feel depressed, but sometimes I feel like I don't want to do anything. And so I would say that one of the main features, thank you for that, by the way, Owen, one of the main features of depression is this internal running narrative of, I don't want to do anything. I'm not going to enjoy anything I'm going to do. I don't feel like doing anything. Anything I try to do is not going to be helpful. It feels as if no matter what you move into doing, it's going to be useless or kind of not helpful in any way. So that's one of the features of depression. And another is feeling kind of self-critical of yourself on top of it. And so part of the treatment of depression is what we tell people to do is thinking about the things that may have historically been helpful. And so at times when therapy, what I'll do with people is I'll say, tell me about the things 6 months ago or a year ago before you were dealing with depression that were enjoyable, or maybe you got just like a little bit of enjoyment or pleasure out of. And so this can be things like sports or art, or playing video games, or going for a walk, or playing with your dog, or whatever it may be. And what we'll tell people to do is to do their best to try to schedule some of those things onto their schedule, whatever is possible, and saying, I know, just like those passengers on the bus, I know that they're going to show up in my head and try to tell me not to do this, or tell me this is not going to be helpful. But if I tell myself, in spite of the internal negativity, I'm still going to try to put one foot in front of the other and just see. That's kind of an experiment, like how enjoyable or how awful, is it to do this thing? And I'm going to rate my pleasure from 1 to 10 afterwards to say, how pleasurable is this thing I'm doing? Sometimes you can start to find some of the things on that list may actually not be very pleasurable or not be enjoyable when you're not feeling well, but some of them may surprise you. And so the more people can do that, as well as I would say, the more people can seek support, have a network, not feel as alone or isolated can be helped as well too. So I think we're running down on time. I do want to say that you are in great hands for the rest of the day. Many of the folks coming on, including Dr. Katrina Lindsay and some of the others who are following me, have wonderful ideas and can probably follow up on some more resources as far as for those who may need it for depression or anxiety or other things as well. Also, please feel free. I know my email was on the last slide. Angela or others with the TAA can share some of my information if you didn't feel like I got around to your question. And once again, I do feel blessed to be here with you. I've felt a great deal of kindness and compassion and inclusion from the Tourette community. And I wish you guys nothing but blessings in 2021. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phelps. Thanks, everybody. If we didn't get to your question, there is a burning questions panel at the end of the day today. So feel free to ask it again and someone there will probably answer it. If we don't get to it, you can reach out to us and we'd be happy to help you in any way. We have about 2 minutes before the next presentation. So if you want to take a quick break, we're just going to get the next session set up for you. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Phelps.
Thanks. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.